Good afternoon. I call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 76 of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting today for a meeting request pursuant to Standing Order 1064. And I'm sure everyone's seen the 1064. It was in regard to the parameters around the appearance of the Right Honourable David Johnston. As we know, we as a committee have decided that he should be appearing, and I can confirm up to date he's been very receptive to appearing. So I will now recognize members for discussion of this request. Mr. Barrett, followed by Mr. Berthold.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have a motion that I'll read into the record, and then I'd like the opportunity to speak to it, if that's all right.
I'm just going to make sure that it's been circulated around in both official languages. Mr. Barrett, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. That in relation to its study of foreign election interference pursuant to Standing Order 108.3a and of the intimidation campaign orchestrated by Wei Zhou against the member for Wellington Halton Hills and other members, pursuant to its order of reference of Wednesday, May 10th, 2023, the Committee A directs that a summons be issued to the Special Rapporteur, David Johnston, to appear before the committee by himself for 3 hours, no later than 7 days following the adoption of this motion, and B, report to the House forthwith that it reaffirms its support for a national public inquiry expressed in its 25th report, which was concurred in by the House on Thursday, March 23, 2023, and calls upon the government to begin consultations among the recognized parties on the appointment of that inquiry within 24 hours with a view to launching it within 2 weeks. If I may, Madam Chair. Over the last several months, we've seen mounting evidence and through reporting in media with reports from Canada's spy agency that there has been escalating foreign interference by the dictatorship in Beijing in our democratic process. The House of Commons voted by majority for a public inquiry to be held into this matter. Instead, the Prime Minister tapped his friend, a member of the Trudeau Foundation, to run, well, essentially to run interference against this direction of Parliament and the call from a majority of Canadians to have a public inquiry. There is clear evidence that Beijing has undertaken and continues to interfere in our elections. And we know that the Trudeau Foundation was used as a vehicle for Beijing to target Canada's Prime Minister in its campaign of foreign influence. All of the opposition parties have agreed that we need to hear from Mr. Johnston, and it's essential that we do hear from him as to why, following Parliament's direction to the government that a public inquiry be held, that he's advised against it. So we want to take a closer look at the conclusions that he has, take a look under the hood, and that's why we've put this motion forward today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Berthold, just so we all know the speaking list, on Mr. Berthold, suivi par Madame.
Mr. Berthold, Mrs. Blaney, and then Mr. Fergus, and Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Berthold. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, the Prime Minister chose the vehicle and the driver, and he also chose the destination by being the only one to be against an independent public inquiry to shed light on foreign interference by Beijing in our election process. The driver that he chose, the special rapporteur, as he called him, his friend, his ski buddy, his cottage buddy, and a member of the Trudeau Foundation, reached the same conclusion as him. Two people are now convinced that we don't need a national inquiry, an independent inquiry, on Beijing interference. All parliamentarians on in opposition parties, the majority voted on a resolution so a national public inquiry would be held. 75% of Canadians are for such an inquiry and believe that it should go forward. Madam Chair, after months of revelations in news media, after surprising facts being unearthed, facts that have been demonstrated to be true in most cases, we realize today that the public independent inquiry requested by Parliament will not be held because the Prime Minister chose to listen to recommendations made by the driver of the vehicle that he chose. And this vehicle that should bring us to the recommendation with regards to a national inquiry. And so this is why we absolutely need to have Mr. Johnson here to respond to our questions, to shed light on this, and to better understand the process that led him to make this decision and why he ignored in his recommendations the fact that the majority of parliamentarians were calling for a national public inquiry. Thank you.
Mr. Bertrand.
Thank you, Mr. Berthold. Madame Blaney.
Well, thank you, Chair. It's a bit disappointing that we're having to do this today. I'm not content with the outcome of the report that Mr. Johnstone provided us. I think for me, the focus has always been on how serious this is and how important it is that Canadians trust their institutions. And so here we are in this position again. I am sure, like many of the members in this place, I have many important meetings that I was planning to do with constituents. Right after this meeting, I have had to move everything to accommodate them. So it's disappointing that we're here. And I think it really outlines the reality that Canadians need to see a process that is transparent and clear, that they can have trust in. And this process is certainly not feeling to be that. So I have a couple of questions, Chair, and then I will listen to my fellow members. I guess the first question I have is for the Chair. Do we have a date or a tentative date for Mr. Johnstone to come and be with the committee? I know you were working diligently on that, so I think that's an important part of this conversation. And the other aspect that I'm curious about is if we don't have a date, is there any indication of when he is proposing, so that we can at least have that context in the conversation? And then the second question I have is for the mover of the motion, which is just focusing on why we're going directly to summons. I'm just curious if I could have a bit of understanding. I know that I submitted a motion to have the special rapporteur come and speak to our committee. That was something that I felt was really important as we address these issues of serious concern. So I guess I'm just trying to understand what that process for. Is there any indication from either the chair or from the member who put forward this motion that the special rapporteur is not wanting to come see us? I certainly hope that isn't the case. So I'll leave that to you, Chair, and then if you could just add me on the list wherever we are next, and I'll put up my hand.
Sorry, Mrs. Blaney, oh, you re-put it up here. Do you want Mr. Barrett to respond first, or would you like me to respond first?
I will leave it to you, Chair.
Mr. Barrett?
Thanks, Madam Chair, and appreciate Madame Blaney's comments and question. It's been just shy of 2 full months since the committee passed the motion for Mr. Johnston to appear, and I think 56 days by my quick count since she asked since Mrs. Blaney asked the question, but I guess your answer may shed some new light on the situation if there is a date that's been proposed and that the committee is going to be made aware of. But absent the commitment of Mr. Johnston to appear at the committee after 2 months, that's the rationale for summons being the wording that and the tool being used in the motion.
I should just start by saying, just in case there's ever question about it, I graduated from the University of Waterloo, and at the time, David Johnston was my president. So today he's the Right Honourable David Johnston, but at that time he was the president of my university, and his signature is on the piece of paper that I have. So I'll just put that on the record. I'm a proud graduate of the University of Waterloo, and I encourage anyone watching to consider the fine institution that it is. As I have shared with members, and Mr. Barrett, I know you're not a regular member to this committee, though we appreciate you coming every so often. I have shared that Mr. Johnston actually had responded to confirm that he would not be able to appear before May 23rd as was requested by committee members, but promptly responded to our request and had confirmed June 6th as the date that he would be appearing as the first date that was possible after the report was provided. So that is information that I have shared with members, but I guess not in this forum. So to your question, Mrs. Blaney, we have not had reluctance on the part of the Right Honourable David Johnston to appear. He has provided a date that would work as long as it was with our worked within the committee business, and so we've slated him in for that. And on the point about the number of days, we've also had to go through redistribution. We've also had to go through a series of different things. And something I've also stated is that the priority of this committee has been changing on a daily basis, it almost feels like. So for the clerk to actually be slotting in witnesses, what we've seen on multiple occasions is that witnesses will confirm their appearance, and then we have to change them and reschedule them because we changed our focus on a day. So I hope that answers your questions, Mrs. Blaney. Mr. Fergus.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank you for this answer that you've just provided. This same question asked by Mrs. Blaney was in my mind as well. How is it possible that we're going directly to this question of requiring the appearance of a witness whom, up until now, has been extremely transparent with his intention to appear before the committee? After the tabling of his report was published 2 days ago. He confirmed on June that he would appear on June the 6th. I believe this date was reached after negotiating between yourself, the clerk, and Mr. Johnston's office with the Office of the Right Honourable David Johnston. It is extremely important for me to adopt a respectful tone in this discussion. This is a very sensitive file. It's a file where I sincerely believe that the Prime Minister appointed a Canadian who has always been at the service of his country as Governor General, as you were saying, Madam Chair, and also as President of Waterloo University. And I have to say, as a proud Quebecer, he was also President of McGill. The Right Honourable Stephen Harper chose him to play an important role on a difficult file during an investigation with regards to our former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney. Mr. Harper believed that he was a very high-quality individual, and our Prime Minister had determined as well that this was a person who could be given this role, that he could do an in-depth review of this issue. I believe that he did exceptional work. I read his 53-page report. I found that he tackled this file with with a lot of serious. I believe that he's appeared here. He is a gentleman who respects Parliament. He respects Canadian institutions, and he is able to. He has been able to reach these conclusions after an in-depth review of the file. Madam Chair, I find it slightly regrettable to say this, but other than the leader of the NDP, I find it quite disappointing to look at the response of the two other opposition party leaders who refuse to assume their responsibility, to be accountable, and to seek a briefing in order to examine these issues. It has been offered to them by the government, and I think that it is to become Prime Minister of the country, but Mr. Singh and Mr. Poilievre do aspire to become Prime Minister of Canada, and only Mr. Singh was accountable and received briefings, so that if he becomes Prime Minister one day, each day, as Prime Minister, he would receive daily briefings. This goes with the job. We're all MPs. We have to do our job. We have responsibilities. And I think that the highest priority is the security of Canadians, the protection of Canadians. And we have to do this in the most democratic way possible. To do this, we have to use all the tools at our disposal. For my colleagues, parliamentarians from all parties who are part of the committee, the National Security Committee, NSICOP, we call it in English, they have access to this information. I think that we have to do everything we can in order to obtain all the information possible according to our security clearances, and the least thing we can do is to invite Mr. Johnson to appear to share information in as much as he's able to share publicly with us, and to follow the logical course of things. And for those who have security clearances higher than mine, for example, they might be able to obtain further information. As I was saying, I find it quite disappointing that at least two of the leaders have not done this, but I'm encouraged, nonetheless, that one wants to do it. Madam Chair, I'm going to limit my comments on the motion. I think that this motion, well, I suppose you're going to determine if the motion is in order or not. I imagine that you have already determined that the motion is in order. I think it's an irresponsible motion. I think it's irresponsible to drag this out, to make it seem that Mr. Johnson does not want to appear when he's already clearly expressed his will to appear before the committee on June the 6th. And I think that we should take advantage of the offer, and I don't think that we need to play political games, partisan games, by saying that he's resisting any appearance before the committee when he's clearly indicated his will to appear. Madam Chair, I'm going to leave things at that for now. I'm looking forward to hearing my colleagues' comments on both sides of the House.
Fergus.
Thank you, Mr. Fergus.
Next, and I've just gotten some details so that we can all be on the same page. So after the motion and the list of witnesses was approved by this committee, April 28th, the clerk had made a phone call to request the Right Honourable David Johnston to appear. We received a reply on May 1st, and within that reply, it confirmed because of the context of the report, they would not be able to discuss what was in the report until it was released. And so then they offered as the earliest date, which was available to our schedule, and what we were offering was June 6th. And on May 5th, it was confirmed that the Right Honourable David Johnston would be willing to appear on June 6th. Mrs. Blaney, suivi par Madame Goudreau.
Oh, I'm surprised by that. I thought that there were other members before me, but I will take up this time. So thanks to the chair for outlining the committee process. I remember that as well, and that's why I was just questioning a little bit about the summons. So I thank for clarity on that. I did want to point out as well, one of the things that is making me very concerned is I too read through his report, and I have no interest in protecting him as a human being. I think that that's up to Canadians. And I think as politicians in this space who represent constituents from across Canada, our job is to focus on Canadians and what they need to see to feel clarity and trust in their systems. And right now we're seeing that erode through this bit by bit process where things keep coming out in the media. It's quite concerning. But I did review his report, and one of the things that I felt very concerned about is there was not really any significant mention of the gaps in legislation that we've heard witnesses talk about repeatedly in our study on this issue. And so when we talk about how this is going to be addressed in a long-term manner, I was hoping to see that. So these are some of the things that I have questions for Mr. Johnston so that he can explain himself. So I'm hoping that we can do a couple of things in this committee. First of all, make sure that our goal is focusing on Canadians, taking this issue as seriously as it should be taken, recognizing the fact that the way that the information is being exposed is through the media, very frustrating. We know clearly from Mr. Chong's intervention and the work that he has done that there's something fundamentally wrong with our process, because candidates and MPs can be facing significant challenges and not even be told. How do you deal with something if you don't even know to the context that it's happening? So there's obviously some key things, and I hope that we remember that that's why we're here. Just in closing, Madam Chair, so as soon as the 6th, and I'm just trying to clarify, does not mean on the 6th. So I'm just confirming that at this point, as soon as the 6th is all we have, we don't have an actual confirmation for the 6th. And the second question that I have for the chair as well is if he is coming on the 6th, will the House have the resources to make sure that we get those 3 hours? Because I think that's absolutely pivotal, and I think we need to make sure that that's part of our consideration as we go through this process. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Blaney. Before I go to Madame Goudreau, I just want to state, so we do have a confirmation that he's willing to appear on the 6th. We do have our regular meeting slot on June 6th. The way the House of Commons works is we put in deviation requests, and that's something I've said to members on this committee is that we know where there is availability for extra time, and we have, between the clerk and myself, been making those deviation requests, and even when we don't receive them, we respond right away and ask just to give it a second look to see if we can get it. So what will usually happen, it's the week prior as to the way the House of Commons works, so they don't give us approvals too far in advance, but the week before we get the confirmations. So we're just finalizing the extra hours we will have for next week. And so that I will share with committee members as I receive that. So we would have our 2-hour slot on June 6th for sure. We have put in a deviation request, meaning asking for an additional hour. We've also asked for the evening slots, as you know, but we would wait till the week prior to get those answers. So next week we would have more insights as to the additional resources. I hope that answers your question. Madame Goudreau.
Oui, bonjour à vous, chers collègues.
Hello, dear colleagues. So if we do a retrospective, I've heard some elements, Madam Chair, that give me all the arguments that bring us here today. When we talk about the security of our citizens, this is important and we need to act, and that's what we're doing here today. We're acting when we speak, among other things, of making sure that we are a democratic country. This is where everything started. On November the 7th, there was, and it's not the first time I talk about this, a door was opening to shed light on this issue. And everything that we've observed is that nobody wanted to open the door, and all the attempts made by this committee, there's always been multiple reasons to avoid shedding light on this issue. So I'm reassured to hear that there is a date for his appearance on June the 6th. But let us not forget that if we're here today, it's because in the beginning, if we want to be democratic, the majority of parliamentarians in the opposition party had clearly stated that we had to choose an impartial person to do this work. So I don't think that government workers have looked clearly at what has been done over the past few weeks, and it's unfortunate that we have to meet here today. Less than 2 hours ago, I was with citizens at a soup kitchen, and they were saying, "When are you meeting Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Gaudreau? When are you doing that?" And I said, "Listen, I have to leave early because we don't know." And they said, "Why? Why don't you know? It's not clear what happened." We hear about a public inquiry, an independent public inquiry for how many weeks now? We want a public inquiry. What's it going to take? So what's it going to take? Well, it takes what we're doing here today. And, Madam Chair, we have to ensure that we're not going to get burned again. So the potential acceptance, hopefully this will be on June the 6th, but we as parliamentarians needed a guarantee that the rapporteur would appear, because following the publication of his report, when we were talking to people were expecting something substantial, something that would restore trust, to say, okay, we're going to respect confidentiality, but we must proceed with a public inquiry. And you know this full well, it's not the first public inquiry that's ever been held, and it has to be independent. And so now it seems like they're trying to find solutions. Some time has been gained, but there seems to be very little willingness to go to the heart of the issue. And our constituents are telling us not to give up on this. So what I see here is that this meeting will end well, because we're going to be able to formalize Mr. Johnson's appearance, and we will give ourselves some parameters. This is my first statement for today, but I'd like to say that if we want to be truly democratic, well, we have to listen to the voice of the people. We have to listen to the voice of the parliamentarians, and we have to act accordingly. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Merci, Madame Gaudreau.
Thank you, Mrs. Gaudreau.
Monsieur Fergus.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks to all the previous speakers for their comments here. I'm struggling here with this. I have to say, we're in a constituency week. Happy to, of course, meet, but you know, in this particular circumstance, it seems to me, you know, having read the Right Honourable David Johnston's report, which I think is very measured, impartial, has done a thorough analysis, has looked at the detailed intelligence and documentation, has interviewed all of the appropriate people, who has built in, you know, I think a sort of a double check and verification of his conclusions through NSICOP and CIRA. I think, there's this feeling that I have that there's this sort of attempt here to suggest that Mr. Johnston has not been forthcoming or willing to appear before a committee. Just the very fact that the wording of this motion calls for a summons when Mr. Johnston has already expressed a willingness to come to our committee, I think is not a good faith attempt at getting to the bottom of this. It actually demonstrates, to the contrary, an attempt to politicize, again, a person who is in good standing and has an impeccable reputation. And I say this with no partisan interest at all, but I think who's been an upstanding Canadian citizen who's served this country, who's well educated and has served at the highest levels, as the Governor General appointed by Stephen Harper. It just seems to me that there's no length to which the opposition will not go to tarnishing an individual's reputation who, to me, does not deserve it in any way. And I think it's appalling that that's what we're here to discuss. So on the one hand, we have an individual who's done independent work, who's done it well, and I think the opposition doesn't like the conclusions in the report. Therefore, they're trying to create the misperception that somehow he isn't forthcoming and willing to come to our committee, which is quite the opposite of the truth. So, it just seems strange to me that we're here debating a motion that wants to summon somebody who's willing to come to this committee. And then, on top of it, you have individuals here saying that they want to get to the truth, and yet their party leaders will not even get briefed from a national security perspective on the intelligence that underpins all of the conclusions that Mr. Johnston has come to. So, to me, it's hard to take the debate here in good faith, and quite frankly, it sort of makes me angry. And when I hear people say, well, we had to change our schedules and cancel meetings in our riding, et cetera, and I say, well, yeah, but you are the one that called this meeting. So I believe that if we were here for good reason and for a good faith attempt at getting to the truth, I think we're all up to that work, and we've all expressed an interest in doing that. But this is not that, in my view. This is not that. If that were the case, then I think the party leaders, certainly the Bloc leader and the Conservative leader, would both be willing to get the top secret security clearance that they need to review the appropriate documents and see for themselves, just exactly the facts in this particular matter. And within context, which, I think David Johnston spoke to in his report, what he wrote was very clear in terms of the conclusions that much of the intelligence that the largely false allegations or misconstrued information that circulated in the media, that's his word, by the way, misconstrued, I think has been taken out of context. And that's a serious problem. I think we run that risk anytime that we think that we're going to air bits of information that are gained through our intelligence agencies in public, and to do so in a limited manner. I think opposition parties want a public inquiry. When you look at what Mr. Johnston has reported back, I think even he in his report suggested that he came into the position of the special rapporteur thinking that that's exactly where he would land, which would be to call for a public inquiry. But through his, various review of documents and interviews, came to a very rational conclusion, which I would say has been supported by almost every national security and intelligence expert that we've heard from in this committee, that have said, look, like, you can't air all of this stuff in public. You just can't. It will compromise human lives and national security. So I don't know why the opposition parties keep pushing for that. I suppose it's only to create another misperception out there that somehow the government has something to hide, which again is quite contrary to the truth. In fact, our government from day one has expressed a willingness and a very active involvement in combating foreign election interference. And that I've traced in our committee debates over and over and over again. And I feel like maybe I can continue to that if I need to, but it's unfortunate that there's no acknowledgement of the actual facts and actions that our government has taken, which, no one is saying couldn't be improved upon. I think the public hearings that Mr. Johnston has proposed are focused on the various policy areas and directions that there can be, I think, lively debate and efforts to improve the government's response to foreign election interference. And I think there's an acknowledgement that there's communications challenges within the machinery of government and that there can be lots of improvement made there. And I think that's, again, seems to coincide with all of the other things that we've heard time and time again. It coincides with the very real evolving threat and the complexity of combating it that is ever increasing. And I think that that communication and coordination, how intelligence, becomes evidence and how it becomes actionable, I think is really, really part and parcel of what we're up against here. And Mr. Johnston's done a good job of outlining why, an open democratic society like Canada is more vulnerable to these different threats. And I think we all take that very seriously here. I just think that there's an attempt to say, essentially that multiple parties here aren't forthcoming in terms of the truth, which is not the case. So I think what we've got here is an opportunity to say, okay, well, what is a rash? So first of all, I really don't think a summons is necessary at all. I don't know why the special rapporteur who's doing this work would need to be summoned to our committee when he's already expressed a willingness to come. Like, let's just be honest. Come on, let's get to the heart of this. Why would we need to summons? I would love someone to tell me. I'll evoke the Sims protocol if someone tells me why, in good faith, someone needs to be summoned who's already willing to come to our committee. Please, anyone. So why don't we amend this motion? I'll propose an amendment. Let me read it into the record. So I move an amendment that in relation to its study of
Mr. Turnbull, I'm just going to ask,
yes.
just for
yes,
process matters, have you shared this amendment?
No, I have not. No, I'm reading it into record off the floor.
Is it available in both official languages, or do you need it translated?
I may need it translated, but I certainly will send it along.
Could you just do that for me before you read it into the record, if that's suitable?
Sure, yes.
I'm just going to pause for a quick moment as it gets sent. Then we can just have it circulated around. People can see it, then it just functions, I think, a little bit better.
No problem.
Thank you for that. Excellent. Mr. Turnbull, I thank you for letting me know when you did share the amendment with myself and the clerk. I understand that it has been distributed to interpreters as well as members. The floor is now back yours, Mr. Turnbull.
Okay, thanks, Madam Chair. And I hope everyone received that okay. I'm just going to read into the record the motion with the amendment. So I move that in relation to its studies of foreign election interference pursuant to Standing Order 1083A and of the intimidation campaign orchestrated by Wang Zhao against the member of Wellington Halton Hills and other members pursuant to its order of reference of Wednesday, May 10th, 2023, the committee reinvite the special rapporteur, the Right Honorable David Johnston, to appear before the committee by himself for 2 hours, no later than 14 days following the adoption of this motion. And B, report to the House forthwith that it reaffirms its support for a national public inquiry. And maybe I can just say so on and so forth, because the rest does not change.
Did you want to speak to it, or was your preamble the speaking to it?
Well, I mean, I've already spoken to it. I mean, essentially the difference is we're taking out the summons, which is completely unnecessary when someone is willing to come. It creates a false perception that he wasn't already willing to come, which he is. And I think we're amending the amount of time from 3 hours to 2 hours, which I think is more than enough time for the witness to appear. I'm not, overly concerned about the amount of time, but I think 2 hours is our sort of a standard amount of time. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Monsieur Fergus, suivi par Madame Goudreau, puis Madame Blaney.
Mr. Fergus? Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would like to thank my colleague, Mr. Turnbull, for his amendment. What he's just suggested is quite responsible. First of all, we eliminate this false perception that the Right Honorable Mr. Johnson did not want to appear before our committee. That is false, quite simply. And not only that, but it gives us the opportunity to follow the same process that we normally follow when someone is invited before the committee. They're invited politely, we wait for an answer, and we already have a date, and then everything is fine. Secondly, I like what he suggested as well. For the rest of it, it allows us time to do our work as MPs and to better understand the reasoning used by Mr. Johnson when he chose to recommend to the Prime Minister and to Canadians what he recommended in his report. I believe that it's an excellent amendment. There might be other sub-amendments that might improve the motion, but I think Mr. Turnbull has made a great amendment. When I raised my hand, I wasn't wanting to speak to this amendment. I wanted to speak about my exasperation before the reasoning provided by my colleague, Mrs. Gaudreau, when she said that the Prime Minister did not really want to see reality, and I find that frustrating because what we see is that her leader, same as Mr. Poilievre, both of those leaders are refusing to receive a briefing session with national security experts to know everything they need to know on this file. And that way they could reach the conclusion that they would reach. They would at least have the information to reach an enlightened decision. This way, we hope to continue to direct the work of this committee and other parliamentary committees so that we're able to provide information and conclusions in as much as we're able to provide information with the public. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Mrs. Gaudreau. Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I understand the frustration that someone might feel when many government MPs see very clearly what's happening, have already gone through this before. So I understand that in succeeding to demonstrate a good faith, the legitimacy of each action in order to show what a democracy might be, that must be very difficult, I do agree. This being said, that is not in the facts. This is not the fact. The way that things were done was not that way. In a democracy, we consult people, we choose, and some people are less happy, but we vote. And at the House of Commons has not voted on the special rapporteur, who might have been Mr. Johnson, but the Prime Minister chose, not the House of Commons. Why? Why is it? And I'm thinking of my leader. Why would my leader, who has access to classified documents, to understand what happened, and afterwards say, oh, I'm not able to talk about it. You have to keep things secret as well, because the information cannot be disseminated. Well, why do we want a public inquiry? Because we want to respect confidentiality. And I'm not going to go through this. The Rouleau Commission, other commissions, we can go up to the 60s. That's not what we want to do, but I understand. I understand that the leader of the Bloc Québécois does not want to have access to information that he will be unable to do anything with. That's it for that. Now, the amendment. I understand that for quite a while now, we had believed that Mr. Johnson should appear before the committee. And Madam Chair, I said this earlier, I have the impression, and people are watching and people are listening. And if we want to show to what extent we're able to get to the heart of this, because this is quite serious. This has a serious impact on our democracy. So why 2 weeks? How many days until the end of the session? Madam Chair, what I've experienced is that the longer we stretch things out, well, in this motion, it is written guaranteeing that if there's no prorogation, fine. But otherwise, I don't agree. And June the 6th, well, it should be in the days. It should be on Tuesday. It should be as soon as possible. So this idea of 2 weeks, once again, I need to hear a really convincing argument, because the work was already done by the rapporteur. The report is there. So I'm looking forward to hearing answers to my questions, because I don't want a prorogation and something else to be talked about. This is my first reaction. I don't agree.
Mrs. Blaney?
Well, thank you for providing an amendment. And I will always talk about how important it is to meet with my constituents, even if that upsets my Liberal colleagues. I take my job really seriously, and seeing this report and what came out of it was very concerning to me. That's why I agreed that we should have this meeting. So I think it's unfortunate that it has to be made political, but I guess that's your choice. So I just have a couple of recommendations to my friend who provided this. The first one is I can't support 2 hours. I think we need 3 hours to get to the details of this issue. So I certainly hope that they'll consider changing that. I'm fine with removing the summons. I don't understand the 14 days in the context that I've just heard from the chair. That the plan is for the 6th. So if I could get clarity on that, that would certainly help me decide what I'm going to do next.
Mrs. Blaney, sorry, can you confirm what you'd like clarity on?
So what I would like clarity is why the 14 days. When I look at the motion, it says re-invite. So I don't understand what that means. Does that mean that we want the special rapporteur to come in on the 6th and then come again in 14 days, which maybe that would make sense. Maybe we'd like to have him for 3 hours and then have him again in 2 weeks. So I'm just asking for clarity. And if, as the chair has said, that we seem to be having a meeting on the 6th, why are we putting the 14 days? I'm fine with removing the summons because it makes sense if we've already got a commitment from the special rapporteur. If we don't, then maybe we need to discuss that again. So I'm just asking for clarity from Mr. Turnbull on those.
So I am going to I have Mr. Barrett on the list next, but Mr. Turnbull, I'm going to ask you just to quickly answer Mrs. Blaney's question.
So it says re-invite because we're acknowledging that the special rapporteur was already invited and was willing to come. The 2 to 3 hour, your comment about 3 hours is, fine. I'm not really stuck on the amount of time. I think the 14 days gives us until, if I'm not mistaken, about June 8th to June 12th-ish, depending on, maybe the chair can clarify that. I think that gives us time to have him scheduled in. So that was the rationale. I hope that helps.
So I'm just going to chime in. So 14 days would be June 8th. So we would then have confirmed whether he was coming on the 6th or not. And then we would know what next steps, and it would provide us some ability between the clerk and myself to know how we're moving forward. So I do see some of the sense in that. So I hope that clarifies Mrs. Blaney's question. I'm going to go to Mr. Barrett, followed by Mr. Turnbull, et puis Mr. Fergus. Mr. Barrett.
Thanks, Chair. As I said before, the committee invited Mr. Johnson passed that motion 2 months ago. The report has been issued. Canadians have questions, and having Mr. Johnson appear is what needs to happen. The summons guarantees that he appears for 3 hours, and it also removes some of the variables like speakers previous mentioned, that should there be prorogation or other interruptions to sittings of the House, that if the can's kicked down the road weeks and weeks, then we could find ourselves in a position where we don't have the opportunity to ask these vital questions. So the motion in its original form, looking for Mr. Johnston to appear for 3 hours in a week's time, provides the opportunity for accountability that we're looking for.
You get a rating? Thank you, Mr. Barrett. I'm just also trying to manage the schedule as to having witnesses come. As we know, a motion was passed. There was a series of witnesses that were on that list. Being constituency week, the clerk has been inviting the people within that motion. I understand that perhaps additional names are being provided as well, so we're just trying to figure that out. So moving these pieces around we end up rescheduling people who have been confirmed. And I was just asking if any of the ministers on the list have confirmed their attendance, and I have just been told that there has been some confirmation. So I'm just going to look at those details to share them with the committee. So that's where the dates all fill in really quickly, because we've got so many moving pieces, and that's where the challenge always is. Mr. Turnbull.
Sorry, I forgot I was on the list again, but that's great. Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have just a couple of things to add here. One was just that I seem to recall, a conversation that we had as a committee about when we preferred Mr. Johnston to appear in this study. And I actually recall myself recommending that he come before his report, and other members seemed to be more interested in him appearing after the report was released. So it's interesting that the committee was there previously to have him come after the report was issued, which I think was the committee's overall preference, which, and then he's actually expressed the willingness to come, in accord with what we desired or preferred as a committee. And yet we still have the Conservative members implying a little less forcefully now, but at least at the outset of our meeting, implying somehow that there was an unwillingness to come on his part, which is contrary to the truth. So I would ask that they retract that, and that we get down to just moving forward as a committee here. Thanks.
Fergus.
So, Madam, I've listened to Mr. Barrett, Ms. Blaney, and Mr. Turnbull. So I'm just trying to seek out some clarification, perhaps. I don't know, between Mr. Turnbull and Ms. Blaney. But Mr. Turnbull, did I understand that you're willing to amend it to address Ms. Blaney's concerns about moving from 2 to 3 hours? And secondly, Ms. Blaney, I'm trying to figure out, is it clear then on the 14 as opposed to 12 days, and that question of re-invite? I'm trying to figure this out, Madam Chair, because I'm trying to figure out how I should vote on the sub-amendment, on the amendment. Forgive me.
Is that a question that you would like Mrs. Blaney to answer right now, or are you okay? Was that more just...
You are Ms. Blaney?
Mrs. Blaney, do you want to answer that?
I haven't had my question answered from Mr. Turnbull, which, unless I completely missed it, and I apologize, I do think it should be 3 hours. I don't think it should be lowered down to 2 hours. So I think,
sorry, I don't want to talk over you. I think Mr. Turnbull responded saying he was receptive to that.
Okay.
Would you like to sub-amend that, or do we just all want to agree that we want 3 hours and instead of it being 2 hours? I see heads nodding. Mrs. Blaney, do you have a preference? Do you want to sub-amend it, or can we just...
I'm fine as long as it says 3 hours. If everybody agrees, then that's great.
Would you like to sub-amend it, or Mr. Turnbull, would you just like to make your...
I can't sub-amend my own
I know you
amendment,
can't,
so...
but do you just want to make it 3 hours again? Yes.
Sure, Madam Chair, I'd be happy to.
So for the record, Mr. Turnbull, where he mentioned the Right Honourable David Johnston for 2 hours, it actually is 3 hours. So just to make sure we're all in the same conversation, the number of hours is not changing. What is changing is that we re-invite the Right Honourable David Johnston to appear. If that is not received, then we look at the next step of summoning the Right Honourable David Johnston. I'll be honest with you, I don't think it will come to that. Based on the email chain that I've just reviewed, very receptive to appearing. It seems like we have a date and we can make this work. we'll have to work on making sure the hours are available. And I'm sure there's many people watching this meeting to know that committee members are making their points as to why that would be relevant. So I'm going to now go to, I have Mr. Berthold, followed by Mrs. Blaney. Did your hand go down? Yes. And then I have, so Mr. Berthold, and then I have Mr. Barrett.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Juste ajouter la...
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to add an argument as to why Mr. Johnson should appear next week. You said that you are preparing the appearance of different witnesses, ministers, mentioned in Mr. Johnson's report. And I think that before having people appear, people who are going to come and speak to the Johnson report, we should speak with him first. I think it's just logical. He's a new element this week. It's a new report. And I don't see how we can continue our study on foreign interference when an important part was made public. That is the report of the special rapporteur was made public. So we can't wait 14 days. We can't wait to have gone through a whole week of hearings on the Beijing interference without having heard Mr. Johnson speak first. So why? You said that you read a series of email exchanges. I think it might be possible to ask him to appear next week. And if he can assure us that he will be here for 3 hours next week, I mean, we don't have to have a summons, but we have to hear Mr. Johnson before we hear anyone else's version. It's fundamental, and we've known this since November, since we've been studying. Information has been coming out drip by drip, and all of a sudden we have a huge amount of information by the special rapporteur through his report, and on the basis of this information, on the basis of the information that he says he cannot disclose, but we can ask questions of Mr. Johnson before questioning witnesses that will appear. I would humbly invite my colleagues to think about this. Mr. Johnson should be the next or nearly the next witness to hear if we want to do our work properly and then ask questions of other witnesses. So my comments are for all parliamentarians. I understand that Mr. Johnson had responded to this invitation before knowing that we wanted to have him next week. So if he's truly of good faith, Mr. Johnson will tell us that he's prepared to come next week to speak to his report. I don't see why we would change. I don't see why we need to wait 14 days when next week we will hear many witnesses depending on the available resources, Madam Chair. If we hear many witnesses next week, that we might have to re-invite them because Mr. Johnson will have provided us other relevant information with regards to these witnesses, so we might do our work for nothing. I believe it is essential to have the Mr. Johnson, because his report, it raises many questions for the MPs, for the population, so I'm insisting on this. We cannot wait to June 6th or June 9th to hear Mr. Johnson speak. He absolutely has to appear next week.
Donc, premièrement, ce n'est pas le...
First of all, it's not the 6th or the 9th. It's the 6th. He's already shared a date.
As a person who is trying to chair this committee to get us to the work that we're trying to do, one day it's let's get this done, we have a great plan. One day it's a question of privilege has been referred to this committee, then we have to make that the priority. One day it is then this and then this. So next week, as per the motion that was moved by our colleague in this committee that was supported, we asked for certain witnesses to come for a prescribed amount of time, which is very difficult when you're in these seats trying to make this work. So respectfully, I will say to you that unless you're suggesting that we not meet until the Right Honourable David Johnston is coming to meet, and the work that we're doing is important, we need to take into consideration what we need to do to function as a committee to make sure witnesses are present. And so as I had said, we had asked for Jody Thomas to appear for a prescribed number of hours. We're receiving confirmation. And now you're suggesting, based on that commentary, that we ask her to reschedule her appearance because we can't do anything until David Johnston appears, which it's almost like suggesting that the question of privilege is no longer the priority, and now it's the Right Honorable David Johnston's report, which is the priority. And I'm just trying to add this up in my head as to how do I, as a chair of a committee that I think is very important, doing very important work, keep the train on the tracks so that we can actually get some work done. But we keep going in circles with the comments I'm hearing as to who needs to go first. We agreed to a list. We wanted witnesses to come. And now we're having a conversation. It almost feels like who's the most important person to come first and whatever else. And I feel like I have done whatever I can to get us witnesses. But their schedules, these are people at the end of the day. They have schedules and they're doing really important work. And it's almost like we want them to have full-time seats at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. And so I'm just going to share my little comments on that, because we're doing a lot of confirming witnesses and then changing them around, which is not necessarily moving us forward. And I guess that gives Mr. Barrett some additional comments for when you speak now. Mr. Barrett, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Chair. Appreciate your comments, and so I won't expand on what's been offered, but I just want to move us forward. I've just shared a sub-amendment with the clerk, and that's that the amendment be amended by replacing 14 days with 7 days.
Can we just circulate that around? I'm going to ask the clerk to circulate around the sub-amendment that Mr. Barrett has just shared to make sure it's available. Did you want to comment on it, or just moving the sub-amendment? You'll just move the sub-amendment and keep it there? And so I'm going to go to Monsieur Fergus.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm going to certainly cut my colleague and friend a little slack, because while you were speaking to us, he was probably writing that sub amendment, getting it in both languages, and sending it to the clerk. So he might not have had time to incorporate what you just said to us to try to treat people like people. So I'm hoping he might see this as a friendly. If he would like to consider this wording, but why doesn't he just change the wording to that we invite Mr. Johnson, the Right Honorable David Johnston, at the earliest opportunity and no later than June 6th. And then that way, Madam Chair, if we can get him here next week, that would be fabulous. And for the reasons that are important for us to be able to have him for those 3 hours and then move on with our other witnesses, that would make sense. But it also, treats people like people who are doing important work for our country, into making sure that, they can look at their schedule and try to make it to find the best possible time that conveniences us as well as conveniences them. And so I'm hoping that might be some wording that my colleague would consider. I think that would probably be the best thing that takes into account what you had just, I think, so rightly pointed out to us.
Madame Gaudreau, je sais.
Mrs. Gaudreau, I know that you've raised your hand. I'm going to go to Mr. Barrett first and then to you. Thank you.
I appreciate the spirit of Mr. Fergus's suggestion, but I would like to leave it as is, and would note for him and for you, Madam Chair, that the sub-amendment doesn't relitigate the question of a summons versus an invitation. And I think that the proposed witnesses' availability is in the invitation speaks to that. So let's. I think that this satisfies both the concerns raised by Mr. Ferguson and some of his colleagues with respect to the nature of a summons.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Madame Gaudreau?
Oui, Madame la
Madam Chair, I agree. I'm sure that it's not easy to compose with the logistics of witnesses who are no doubt following the news as we are, and
important de ne pas oublier notre bonne foi.
it's important to remember that we are trying to act in good faith. Given where we are today in our parliamentary calendar, we are pushing because we are not in February, unfortunately. So people who are listening, I would like to ask the question, do you think that questions specific to the report, the 55-page report that was tabled, to make sure that democracy is healthy, is secured? We are all in agreement as parliamentarians. And a question came to mind, given that we only have a few meetings left, and I know the logistics are very complicated, but why 14 days when we know that what is important, what is urgent, we know what's important, and sometimes we don't have a choice. Some elements make it so that surely people will understand. They will understand because for them as well, the witnesses that appear, depending on the questions that might be asked, I am sure that they would want to have these elements after a 3-hour hearing with Mr. Johnson. So I would be prepared to vote. I haven't had an answer to my questions as to why 14 days when we already had the June the 6th, and at the same time we know that when we completed our work, it was the time to disclose this so we can we know that this is a quick call that can be made. So if there's a good argument that explains to me the fundamental reason why, oh, yes, we can be in good faith and go to June the 6th, well, perhaps I'll accept it. But otherwise, this is a key time. It's we're at a crossroads with everything that we've experienced for weeks and months now, and I don't feel at all ill at ease in inviting someone who did work. I think an individual such as Mr. Johnson expected to be called to the PROC committee very quickly. And I hope this is the case for all of you. This is extremely important. It is crucial. And I will end by saying that I'm convinced that our witnesses who are possibly watching this will full well understand that, yes, we'll have to play around with the agenda. So I'm prepared to vote, but other people wish to speak, I believe.
Gaudreau, mais on a toujours maintenant la main de Madame Blaney, donc on va entendre ce qu'elle veut partager, Madame Blaney.
So I just have one question, then I'm more than happy to vote. And that just is, you talked quite at length, Chair, about the schedule that was already outlined. And I just wondered if you would be sharing that with the committee so that I can better understand the concern.
Yes, so actually the clerk and I were scheduled to have a conversation about this today, but we're all together at PROC, so I can have it with the clerk in person rather than virtually, and we're going to be laying out a calendar as to where we see things falling so that members can be prepared. As you all know, I have asked for extra resources next week and for the following week, so there will be extra meetings also taking place to satisfy as many appearances as possible. And that's where we're just trying to juggle several different things. And because, as I had mentioned earlier, it would be about today that we would get the schedule for next week, we have a better understanding as to what deviation requests were approved versus not today. And that provides us the insights that we needed. So yes, please stay tuned. It will be coming to a computer screen near you very soon. Does that help? Perfect, thank you. With that, my list has been exhausted. I'm calling the question on Mr. Barrett's sub-amendment. Clerk.
Okay, Mr. Barrett.
Not usually, but today.
Oh, that's it.
It's your motion, that's why.
Mr. Berthaud.
Oui.
Mr. Calkins.
Yes.
Mr. Nader.
In favor.
Ms. Romanato.
Contre.
Ms. Sahota.
No.
Mr. Turnbull.
Against.
Mr. Fergus.
Contre.
Mr. Fisher.
No.
Madame Gaudreau.
Oui.
Ms. Blaney.
No.
5 yeas, 6 nays.
5 yeas, 6 nays. The nays have it.
5 yeas, 6 nays.
Nays have it. So the nays have it. The sub-amendment is defeated. We are back onto the amendment of Mr. Turnbull. Any other comments on the amendment of Mr. Turnbull as not sub-amended? Mrs. Blaney, yes.
Just if we could get that read out to us one more time, that would be helpful.
The clerk would love to do that.
In English, the sub-amendment would basically be replacing Section A of the motion. So, parentheses A, re-invite the special rapporteur, the Right Honourable David Johnston, to appear before the committee by himself for 3 hours, no later than 14 days following the adoption of this motion. En français,
Re-invite the Special Rapporteur, the Right Honourable David Johnson, to appear before the committee by himself for 3 hours, no later than 14 days following the adoption of this motion.
Mrs. Blaney? Hand is down. And Mr. Fergus, I'm just going to make a quick comment once again, and I'm sorry about all the commentary today, but I do believe this committee is very important, and I know we've had this conversation about appearing by themselves. Sometimes people do bring people with them based on the information they need, so I would just be mindful that even watching some of the press conference with the Right Honourable David Johnson, he did refer to some of his team members, so if we actually do want the information, it might be relevant to make sure the person has the ability to have those people. Mr. Clerk says that we have an answer for this already, so we're good to go. Mr. Fergus.
Madam Chair, and again, trying to be respectful to my colleagues, I would wonder if we would entertain, or if my colleague Mr. Turnbull would entertain a small change where we would just say as, as, as soon as possible that the Right Honourable David Johnson is invited as soon as possible, no later than June 6th.
Mr. Turnbull, do you consider that a friendly amendment, which isn't a thing, but do you want it?
Yes, I do. I think that's a very good suggestion, and I think it shows a little bit of room to move in the direction of where the consensus is building here in this conversation. So I appreciate that attempt by my colleague.
Est-ce que je peux offrir une traduction en français?
Can I provide a French translation, or did the clerk understand the intent?
We have some agreement, even though it does not follow procedure and the clerk is not appreciating it so much. But we as a committee are masters of our own domain, and we can make things work when we want to. So we appreciate the leniency provided by procedure people. With that, my list is exhausted, and I'm going to call the question on the motion as amended. On the amendment. No. On the amendment. Oh, that's right. Just on the amendment. The amendment didn't get amended because the sub-amendment failed. So it's the amendment as friendly amended. I know you're having. It's going to be fine. We're going to call the question on the Right Honourable David Johnson appearing no later than June 6th for 3 hours is the amendment.
To start with Mr. Turnbull.
Yay.
Ms. Romanato.
En faveur.
Ms. Sahota.
Yes.
Monsieur Fergus.
En faveur.
Mr. Fisher.
Yes.
Mr. Nader.
No.
Mr. Barrett.
Nay.
Monsieur Bertol.
No.
Mr. Calkins.
No.
Madame Gaudreau.
Oui.
Ms. Blaney.
Yes.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
The amendment carries, and we are now back on to the debate of the main motion as amended. Debate. Mr. Fergus.
I would just want to make sure, Madame, j'aimerais juste m'assurer, Madame.
I just want to make sure, Madam Chair, that we're understanding the motion as amended. Could the clerk read, or is this something that we have in our emails? I didn't check my email.
So basically what is on the floor right now is the motion that was moved by Mr. Barrett, and part A has changed of that motion. The rest has stayed the same. Does that answer your question, Mr. Fergus? C'est bon. Mr. Turnbull, suivi par Mr. Fergus.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. So just reading the motion as amended, I think there's still some issues with Clause B. Clause B says, report to the House forthwith that it reaffirms its support for a national public inquiry expressed in its 25th report, which was concurred in by the House on Thursday, March 23rd, 2023, and calls upon the government to begin consultations among the recognized parties on the appointment of that inquiry within 24 hours with a view to launching it within 2 weeks. So I have a bit of an issue with this clause in the motion. It seems to me that, we've had an independent special rapporteur go through a thorough process. The Right Honorable David Johnston has landed, even though, as I said earlier, having come into his appointment and doing that work, that was under the assumption that he would likely land on a public inquiry, has, I think for a very good reason, landed on not having one, but instead landed on having public hearings. I think he's said in his report as to why a national public inquiry would not be able to navigate around the very real tensions that exist, when dealing with matters of national security and highly classified information, that those cannot be aired in public. And I think that we've all heard that time and time again. We seem to see opposition parties that don't want to admit that that's counterproductive to the overall objective that I think we share. If we get down to the root of it, we all share a very common concern for our democracy and our democratic institutions. And I think we're all very committed to protecting those and ensuring that we have processes in place that can counter the, successfully combat and counter attempts at foreign election interference and all forms of foreign interference for that matter, not merely within the elections period. But so I think, it just, this portion of the motion calls for a public inquiry, which I think is consistent with what we've heard before from opposition members. It just doesn't seem like I think the very real concerns around airing that information in public is being taken seriously by individuals that would call for a public inquiry after reading the 55-page report Mr. Johnston, the Right Honorable David Johnston, has done. And I can't really understand why that would need to be in there. I think our government I think it was a helpful move to appoint someone that was independent and impartial to look at all the facts and to make a recommendation on this. And obviously having the Right Honorable David Johnston come to this committee, and I'm sure opposition members will dig into his rationale for not recommending a public inquiry at the end of the day. I think, it just, to me, Section B really tries to circumvent this whole process, which is, I think, been a fair, rational, impartial process that has landed in, a place that I think makes sense given all of the national intelligence and security experts and the things that they've recommended, and the very real concerns that I think we all have around exposing or having intelligence revealed in public and disclosed in public, and just how harmful that would be to methods, human assets, and for many other reasons that would compromise national security, that I don't think, perhaps not all of us fully understand. I mean, I think that's part of the issue at times. Perhaps, we're not all aware of just, how harmful this information may be. But I think we've seen with Han Dong, for example, just how harmful false allegations can be. And you know, I don't know. I feel for Han, having been the victim of a lot of allegations that have circulated that are false, that are clearly false, that Mr. Johnston in his report has done a thorough analysis of, and landed very firmly on the fact that these allegations that were circulated and reported on by the media were only giving a very small slice of information, and that really you know, was harmful indeed to Mr. Dong's reputation. And so I don't know how you get that back as a member of parliament, but I think that should be something that we're all concerned with. And it's just an example of how, when you take intelligence out of context, when you air it in public, when you're not treating it with the gravity and care that it deserves, that you're liable to create harm. Maybe it's unintended harm. I know that the intention here is to have the public gain greater awareness of the issues, and you know, certainly how the government is addressing them, and I think that's important. But I also don't think that the opposition parties are fully operating in a way that actually acknowledges the facts, and I've pointed to that many times over. So maybe I'll leave it there, but I just wanted to express my concerns for B, the clause B in Mr. Barrett's motion. And so, you know, I think we've got to make an amendment there, and maybe I'll leave room for my colleagues to contribute more to that discussion. Thank you.
Mr. Fergus?
I'll be brief, Madam Chair. I think that Mr. Turnbull is correct. The impact on Mr. Dong's reputation was horrible, and I'm very pleased. And for me, this was the surprise of the report produced by the Right Honourable David Johnson, was the fact that he was able to respond to that issue and to say that the allegations against Mr. Dong, who was in the media, that the conclusions were hasty and false. And after reviewing a broader scope of documents, secret documents, he came to the conclusion that it was not true. For me, this was a very good thing. All MPs representing our ridings that represent Canadians, we are always, always at the mercy of false allegations, of incomplete information, of hasty conclusions being taken. And I think that, well, I congratulate him, because by looking at the broader issue, he was able to state this publicly. There is no MP that is safe from this type of allegation, and I'm very pleased that he chose to make those comments in particular. Madam Chair, I agree with my colleague, and for that reason, as well as other reasons that he mentioned, I am extremely favorable to these changes that Mr. Turnbull is suggesting. Thank you.
Merci, Mr. Fergus. Mr. Fergus, je suis...
Thank you, Mr. Fergus, but did you mention an amendment, Mr. Turnbull, and you didn't share it? Madam Chair, I know that One moment, I'm finding this on my screen. Madam Chair, I'm sorry. It's not necessary if you don't have anything to add. I have an amendment. It's going to be very simple, Madam Chair. I thought Mr. Turnbull had mentioned an amendment, so it's simply that we strike Part B of the motion proposed by Mr. Barrett.
So my understanding is that Mr. Fergus is amending the main motion as amended by deleting section B. Correct, Mr. Fergus? Excellent. Seeing no massive reaction, may I call the question on removing section B of the main motion? I call the question.
Mr. Fergus.
Je suis contre. Je suis pour.
Ms. Romanado.
Yes.
Ms. Sahota.
Sorry about that. Yes.
Mr. Turnbull.
Yes.
Mr. Fisher.
Yes.
Mr. Nader.
No.
Mr. Barrett. Monsieur Berthold.
No.
Mr. Calkins.
No.
Madame Gaudreau.
Non.
Miss Blaney.
No.
5 yeas, 6 nays.
Amendment is defeated. Back onto the main motion as amended. Mr. Fergus?
Madame la Présidente, moi,
Madam Chair, I would like to table a motion. I will share it with the clerk in a moment, Madam Chair. But the motion reads as follows. Mr. Fergus, so you are going to share something with us? Yes? So we're going to wait for you to share it with the clerk, and then we'll send it off to everyone. Is that okay? Yes, that's great. Okay. understand that everyone has received it.
Parole est le vôtre.
The floor is yours. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to thank my colleagues for allowing me to present this change. What I would like to suggest is it's quite clear as an amendment. I'm going to read it. After the words March 23rd, 2023, we're going to insert and after there will be an I and a double I, and to ask the opposition to accept the change at 4D of Section 8 of the first report made by the special rapporteur. The interpreter, sorry, I really don't have a copy of this yet. I'm still waiting. In order to be able to read, including the confidential annex, it would read...
Order, Chair.
Mrs. Blaney?
I'm just letting the chair know that the interpreters have not received the information, so they're doing their best to respond to this, but they have noted that they have not received it, which makes it harder for them to do their work. So just out of respect, I'm wondering if the chair could work with us to make sure the interpreters have the correct information. Thank you.
100% d'accord avec Madame Blaney.
Mrs. Blaney, we're going to suspend real quick because we've just had a switch over with interpreters, and we'll get that rectified and then coming right back. Stay tuned. Back to order. I apologize for that quick suspension. We do have contact with the interpreters now, and it turns out computers don't like water, but there is other computers to replace the watered computers. I'm going to give the floor back to Mr. Fergus, and then
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Mr. Nader, point of order.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would seek a ruling from you, but I would submit that the amendment is out of order since it goes beyond the scope of the original motion. Namely, it doesn't link in any way to the 25th report of this committee, and it does not relate to a national public inquiry. So I would submit to you that it is out of order and ask for your ruling.
They can challenge the chair and go from there. Perfect. We were actually having a little bit of this conversation, Mr. Nader, and you know I always appreciate your interest in these things. Just based on how committee has functioned, this committee at least has functioned, and the leniency, the clerk and I are not feeling that it is out of order.
I would challenge the chair.
I'll take that in writing, but I think publicly stated feels pretty good. He is challenging the chair? Oh, you are challenging the chair? Oh, then we go to a vote. Let's go.
So the question is, shall the chair's ruling be sustained? And, sorry, I'm looking for Monsieur Drouin. No, sorry about that. It's just half the room is on Zoom here looking through this. Mr. Fergus.
Je suis en faveur de supporter la présidente.
Mr. Turnbull.
Yes.
Ms. O'Connell. Ms. O'Connell. Come back to her. Ms. Sahota.
Yes. And if there is some problem with Ms. O'Connell, can she do like the thumbs up or thumbs down thing? Since the vote?
Yeah, I don't think she can hear us.
À rappel au règlement, il n'y a
Point of order. We're not getting interpretation. Also, there are people in the room whose sound is not being conveyed, so something's up right now.
Merci.
Thank you, Ms. Gaudreau. Are you able to hear me currently? Well, yes, but only in French.
In favor.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask Madame Goudreau and I speaking real quick to make sure people online can hear me in their language of choice. Madame Goudreau, you can hear me in French? Yes, very good. Pour les personnes qui veulent...
And for those wishing to listen in English, are you able to hear me currently? Is it working? Is it working for those wishing to listen in English? For those on the screen? Yes? No? Maybe? Mr. Nader. Oh, it's working. All right, we'll carry on with the vote. Now, Miss O'Connell.
I am. Okay, just
Thank you.
wait.
Sorry, I wasn't getting sound, but I do now.
Perfect. Just stay tuned until the clerk calls your name. Resuming. Well, let's just start that vote again. Mr. Clerk.
Okay, we'll just start over. Mr. Fergus.
I vote in sustaining the President's ruling.
Ms. O'Connell.
In favor.
Ms. Sahota.
Yes.
Mr. Turnbull.
Yes.
Monsieur Drouin.
Oui.
Mr. Nader.
Against.
Mr. Barrett. Nay. Mr. Calkins.
Against.
Monsieur Berthaud. No. Madame Gaudreau.
No.
Monsieur Boulris.
En faveur.
6 yeas, 5 nays.
The ruling is sustained. So we continue with, the floor was Monsieur Fergus Abou, suivi par Monsieur Turnbull. Monsieur Fergus.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to reread the motion, which I am in support of. I hope my colleagues will be in favor of the motion as well. So, after the words, quotation, March 23rd, 2023, and quotation, insert Roman numeral 1. After the words, within 2 weeks, insert Roman numeral 2, calls upon the opposition leaders to accept the recommendation in 4D from Section 8 of the first report, the Right Honourable David Johnston, Independent Special Rapporteur on Foreign Interference, to obtain the requisite security clearance so that they can read and review the full report, including the confidential annex. So, Madam Chair, Section B would read as follows. B. Report to the House forthwith that it reaffirms its support for a national public inquiry expressed in its 25th report, which was concurred in by the House on Thursday, March 23rd, 2023, and 1. Calls upon the government to begin consultations among the recognized parties on the appointment of that inquiry within 24 hours with a view to launching it within 2 weeks. 2. Calls upon the opposition leaders to accept the recommendation in 4D from Section 8 of the first report, the Right Honourable David Johnston, Independent Special Rapporteur on Foreign Interference, to obtain the requisite security clearance so they can read and review the full report, including the confidential annex.
La raison, in English, it says to have it read that report to the House forthwith that it reaffirms its support for a national public inquiry expressed in its 25th report, which was concurred in the House on Thursday, March 23rd, 2023, and 1. Calls for the government to begin consultations among the recognized parties on the appointment of that inquiry within 24 hours, with a view to launching it within 2 weeks, and 2, calls upon the opposition leaders to accept the recommendation in 4D from Section 8 of the first report, the Right Honorable David Johnston, Independent Special Rapporteur on Foreign Interference, to obtain the requisite security clearance so that they can read and review the full report, including the confidential annex. Madame la Présidente, comme j'ai dit...
Madam Chair, as I noted at the very beginning of this meeting, my view is there's only one opposition leader who is doing their job, and that is Mr. Singh, who has said that he will seek out the necessary security clearance to read the confidential sections of the report. I believe that's the responsible thing to do. And the other two opposition leaders have publicly declared that they won't do it. That it's some sort of trap. That it's a situation they won't be able to get out of. Well, Madam Chair, that's quite ridiculous because all of those people want to become Prime Minister of our country, except the bloc leader, of course. Those individuals ought to have a briefing on information of public security importance. And I have trouble getting my head around the fact that they will not take on the duties associated with the position of Prime Minister. So if you're not willing to do that as opposition leader, who's to say they will be willing to do it as Prime Minister? It makes no sense. It's quite ridiculous. We should be the adults in the room. Together we all need to do our duty. Those people need to seek out all of the information needed to come to an informed decision. And if we deprive ourselves of said information, how could we reach any conclusion at all? As such, as I noted, it is important that everyone assume the duties that come with being the leader of a political party. It is very important for those individuals continue at the very least.
For us to be able to ask these leaders before they render judgment to take their responsibilities seriously, and they can do it. You can take a look at confidential and security information, and you might not be able to reveal the deepest details, but you can certainly come to the conclusion, just like David Johnston did in his over almost 60-page report, that where he had read a number of confidential stuff, but he still came to some conclusions which he shared in a transparent manner with Canadians. And I think that is what these leaders should do before they decide to go on and have to go on and have this make all these judgmental statements. I think this is irresponsible. I think it's below what is required for them to assume the office that they expect to do. And so, Madam Speaker, that's why, Madam Chair, that's the reason why I think it's important for us to add this amendment. And I hope that members will support this amendment. If there's some things that we could do to adjust it to make it even better, I'm open to that. But ça c'est l'importance, Madame la Présidente.
The main thing, Madam Chair, is to ensure that the people in question will do their duty to do what is required to be a responsible leader in a parliamentary democratic system. I hope that opposition leaders will read the document, and I hope they will have an opportunity to share their thoughts with Canadians, so long as they do not reveal national secrets. It's not like it goes from 0% to 100%. There's a wide gray area. The Right Honourable David Johnston managed to do it. And I hope that others will do the same. For example, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. Every year, they publish an anonymous report they're in a similar situation as we are. And yet, they have found a way to share their impressions with the Canadian public. So, Madam Chair, I don't want to speak for too long because I am very interested in what my colleagues from other parties have to say. And I hope that they will either decide to improve the amendment or explain why they are opposed to it. Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Mr. Boularice. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm happy to be here with you today to speak about this very important issue, one that is of concern to many Quebecers and Canadians. I hope we'll find a way to move forward as a group. I would just like to follow up on what Mr. Fergus has just said. We in the NDP have a sub-amendment that I will now move to improve, in my view, the main amendment, which has already been tabled by our Liberal colleagues. If I may, I would like to read it. So in Part B, Paragraph B, after including the confidential annex, so after the very last word of the Liberal amendment, we would add, so long as Mr. Boularice, my apologies. Do you have the amendment in both official languages or not? You do? If so, could you please share it with the clerk? Certainly. That would be great. So we'll share it with the clerk and the interpreters, and then I will give the floor back to you. Thank you. Mr. Boularice, yes, we have received the email, so have the interpreters. And I believe that... There we go, yes, the members of the committee have now received it as well. So you have the floor once again, Mr. Boularice. Thank you, Madam Chair. So, yeah, so this follows up on the idea of access to the documents for opposition leaders. We in the NDP always prefer to have knowledge rather than to live in ignorance. We don't like to hide ourselves away and refuse to do our duty. So we would like to add something, which in my view is abundantly reasonable. So after, in paragraph B, after the already moved Liberal amendment, which ends in review the full report, including the confidential annex, the NDP now proposes to add the following: provided those leaders are able to speak as freely about conclusions based on this intelligence report as Mr. Johnston, the Prime Minister, and other members of the Privy Council. So the logic behind this is quite simple. It would be best if all the opposition leaders were on the same page, if they all understood the issues before them. And they shouldn't be muzzled. They should be able to express themselves just as the Prime Minister has, just as Special Rapporteur David Johnston has. Mr. Johnston has been able to table a report. He's been able to give interviews, sometimes quick ones, sometimes longer, in-depth ones. But throughout all this, he has been able to respect the confidentiality of sensitive information. Information that is sensitive for our police services and our secret intelligence services, which could affect national security. We all ought to agree that party leaders should be able to access the information without, of course, putting in danger public servants, members of the public, members of intelligence services. Now, I believe we've already seen what Mr. Johnston has said. I have some certain issues with what he said, but he has been able to responsibly talk about the information he has seen. So that's why we want the leaders to have access to the documents, but they should also be able to express themselves as freely as members of the Privy Council, the Prime Minister, and Special Rapporteur David Johnston. So that's our amendment, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Boulerice. Mr. Turnbull.
Chair, and thanks to Mr. Boulerice for his amendment. I think I had my hand up to speak to the original amendment that Mr. Fergus had put forward, but I can now adapt and speak to the merits of Mr. Boulerice's sub-amendment as well. I think the reason I think that this is important is because throughout our discussions on foreign interference, which started quite some time ago, we've heard a lot of talk from the Conservative Party in particular. They've spoken about bathing in sunlight and transparency, almost as if it was like them seeking salvation on a Sunday morning. It was sort of seen as the holy grail of what we were all trying to achieve here. And certainly they expounded that with great passion all throughout the process. But then when given an opportunity to participate in the Right Honourable David Johnston's work, we saw that all the parties, including the previous Conservative Party leader, Mr. O'Toole, participated, and I would quote from page 8 in the English version: each of Mr. Singh, Mr. Blanchette, and Mr. O'Toole gave their thoughtful perspectives on the threat of foreign interference, whereas Mr. Poilievre, the current leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, refused to participate at all. And when asked multiple times, it looks as though he didn't even have the dignity to respond to the Right Honourable David Johnston's requests, except on Twitter on April 12th. And this is all documented on page 8 in the Right Honourable David Johnston's report. And so, it's just kind of suspect to me that all throughout the process, the Conservative Party and its members have been saying that they want sunlight and transparency, and yet their leader will not participate in the process to get to the bottom of the issues and allegations that have circulated in the media and the very real concerns that have arisen out of those. So I find that highly suspicious, as Mr. Cooper would say. And now I think what we're seeing on top of it is not only did they refuse to participate in the process, but now they're also, and I think this has happened multiple times now, that the Conservative Party leader, and unfortunately the Bloc leader as well, has joined the Conservative Party leader in making public statements, not being willing, expressing their unwillingness to have a briefing and to see the very real, to pull back the veil that they've wanted all of this time, to see the intelligence in its full context and to understand why the Right Honorable David Johnston came to the very rational conclusions that he's come to based on all of the facts and information. So what they're saying now is that truth is a trap. It's a trap, everybody. We're all trying to trap them by offering the information that they've wanted all this time. Now it's a trap all of a sudden. We're setting a trap for them because then they won't be able to speak about it publicly. I would say if you're actually committed to getting to the truth, I mean, how could you possibly claim that truth is a trap? Truth isn't a trap. It's the thing that you've been seeking all along in this process. And at the very moment that you're able to get access to that, you're saying that you're unwilling to do it. So I sort of, for me, I call into question the motives behind the Conservative Party members, and now, unfortunately, the Bloc joining them, in not really wanting to get to the bottom of this, not willing to see the truth, not willing to face the truth, and all the while telling us that this is what they desired. So I think when Mr. Fergus put his amendment forward, which I think is a really strong amendment, it really responds to the section in the Right Honorable David Johnston's report where he talks about the role of opposition leaders and says, and I quote, "I recommend the government start immediately the process of working with the opposition leaders to obtain the requisite security clearance so they can read and review my full report, including the confidential annex." So this is the confidential annex provides all of the information that the Right Honorable David Johnston saw and gathered to make the conclusions that he's made in his first report. And I can't imagine actually claiming that you care about these issues and then not being willing to look at that information and verify whether or not the Right Honorable David Johnston's conclusions are accurate. I can't understand how anyone could legitimately stand up in the public and say you care about the truth of these matters and not be willing to actually read and review those intelligence documents in their full context so that you can formulate your own conclusions and see whether the Right Honorable David Johnston's claims and conclusions are accurate. So I think that the amendment is good. I believe that Mr. Boulouris' sub-amendment makes a lot of sense in that individuals who were able to speak about conclusions, i.e. the Right Honorable David Johnston, the same conclusions that he's been able to disclose, to me, should be fair game for anybody else that's reviewing those documents. So it does seem to me to make sense. I would ask for a friendly amendment, though, to it, in that, just to stay consistent, Mr. Boulouris, I really think it's important to refer to Mr. Johnston as the Right Honorable David Johnston. I think he's earned that title. He's served as our Governor General, and I think we owe him that sign of respect and honor that title comes with. And I think we should just amend your sub-amendment, if you would consider it friendly, to ensure that we're referring to him properly. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Mr. Bulleris, are you okay with adding the Right Honourable David Johnston's titles to your sub-amendment?
It's a really friendly sub-amendment to a sub-amendment.
I'm not going to consider it a sub-amendment. I'm just going to consider it adding those two words, Right Honourable, to your sub-amendment.
I agree.
So we got that there. Okay, perfect. I will now go to Madame Goudreau.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know what? I knew what would happen. I saw this coming a long way off. What's going on is that the committee is trying to find any way imaginable to ignore what a majority of MPs have expressed in the House, to ignore what our witnesses have said. You were there. You heard what they said. Yes, there needs to be a foreign agent registry. All sorts of people have come before the committee, and they have called for an independent public inquiry. Now the committee is trying to get away from that. This is what we are seeing right here, right now. The committee is trying to muddy the waters, as though party leaders somehow have to respect the dictates of a committee recommendation. We have talked about impartiality. But what we really want to do at the end of the day is to protect our democracy, all while being impartial. And I hope people realize this. We are already assuming the impartiality of the Right Honourable, the eminent David Johnston. And yet, this gentleman was not chosen by the House. He was appointed by the Prime Minister. We wanted no one listened to what we as parliamentarians had to say. We as parliamentarians wanted to have a say over the whole process. And now the committee members are saying all party leaders should read the report. And that way, they'll be able to say yes or no to the recommendations, but nothing else. Well, are these committee members coming up with this subject matter experts? Are party leaders subject matter experts? There needs to be expertise here. There needs to be some judge or someone with all the necessary knowledge, someone who is truly, truly impartial. We cannot very well set aside the proximity and the ties that David Johnston has to none other than the Prime Minister himself, the man who appointed him. So again, I will say, maybe you haven't followed We Charity. It seems like it's all happening again, the whole We Charity thing. You get almost to the end of the matter, but you keep the essential secrets secret. Back in March, gosh, there was, 24 hours of filibustering we all went through together. And we heard about the delicate nature of information during an independent public inquiry. we read in the Globe and Mail that one legal expert even said that the Johnston report brings up serious questions about Canada's intelligence services, about the interactions they have, about the communications they have. And this legal expert thought that a national public inquiry would be in order. So I understand that we have resources until 8 o'clock tonight. I would hope that we don't have to stay here that long, but honestly, this tug of war we're going through to defend our democracy, well, I find the behavior of committee members unacceptable. So, in my view, maybe you could open up the toolbox and find some tool. But at the end of the day, we will get what we want. So this sub-amendment, which would require party leaders a requirement, even though the special rapporteur only made a recommendation. Well, that's a whole lot of nothing. I wouldn't say I'm disappointed by what's going on right now in the Procedure Committee. It's as though at the end of the day, partisan politics wins. Partisan politics is winning out over the integrity of our democracy. I've said it before and I'll say it again. We in the Bloc are not out to get power. We are out to get knowledge. And to have knowledge, you need experts, and there needs to be a public inquiry. So, Madam Chair, all I can do is speak to the goodwill of the Bloc leader. He had received an invitation to go talk with Mr. Johnston. He did. And now he's being asked to consult a classified document where he has no guarantee of expertise. There's no guarantee of impartiality. He'll just end up muzzled, as my colleagues have said. I would like to reach an agreement with the other parties, but I don't think that's where we're heading. So that's my first thoughts on the matter. Thank you, Ms. Gaudreau. Mr. Barrett.
We've all had the opportunity to read the report from Mr. Johnston, and it's certainly not a complete review of what we've seen to date, and there are notable omissions from it, including, of course, that the foundation that Mr. Johnston was a part of, the Trudeau Foundation, was the target of a foreign influence operation that saw $140,000 from Beijing-backed donors go to the foundation, and then those cutouts acting on behalf of Beijing then get access to the Prime Minister. And that orchestrated campaign of influence involved another individual from the Trudeau Foundation that the Prime Minister tapped to investigate foreign interference, Morris Rosenberg. And well, Mr. Johnston did comment on some of the reporting, the public reporting about reports from our spy agencies. He must have missed those. Maybe his subscription wasn't up to date with the Globe and Mail when those reports were published. heard lots of comments about people's fitness to hold the office of Prime Minister. But we currently have a Prime Minister who, in the face of a majority vote of the House of Commons to hold a public inquiry, instead picked his neighbor and ski buddy, member of the Trudeau Foundation board, which is mired in the foreign interference controversy, to issue a report. Now, I'll say one thing that should be a cautionary tale to anyone who would take the bait on this on these briefings, and that's that the folks in our bureaucracy who are receiving or who are preparing these reports are delivering them to people in the Public Safety Minister's office or the Prime Minister's office, and they drop binders on the table in front of those who are receiving these reports without context and without technical support, and the matter is considered closed. And that's one of the items that's listed in Mr. Johnston's report. I imagine that this issue of transparency and context has not been remedied since Mr. Johnston issued his report on Tuesday. And so we have ministers who were told, some of them received information, some of it was a failure of the bureaucracy to provide them with information. We saw an awful lot of that. We saw in this report from Mr. Johnston that it was the public service's fault. Where there was fault, it was the fault of the public service and not the fault of government. Well, the government has had their hands on the controls of the machinery of government for 8 years, and are presiding over its brokenness as it's been described by Mr. Johnston. And we don't know what the ministers aren't able to tell us and what the Prime Minister isn't or able to or won't tell us on this. And that's why we need to have a public inquiry. That's why the majority of members elected to the House of Commons called for a public inquiry. We already have an issue where we were just told that we're going to have a couple people the Prime Minister picks take a look at something, and then we're to believe that everything's okay. His challenge so far is the people that he picks are all connected to the Trudeau Foundation. They're all Liberal insiders. Trudeau Foundation to investigate foreign interference in Mr. Rosenberg. Trudeau Foundation to the Trudeau Foundation to act as a special rapporteur in Mr. Johnston. The Trudeau Foundation to provide Mr. Johnston with advice on if he's in a conflict of interest, and you'd be shocked to learn that his colleague on the Trudeau Foundation said that he wasn't, and a lifetime Liberal donor hired as one of Mr. Johnston's staff to advise him in this process. We need a public inquiry. We don't need We don't need a situation where it's just the opposition leaders. We have our party has members appointed to the Committee of Parliamentarians that the Prime Minister has set up. That's not a committee of Parliament. They're going to take a look at the documents and not be able to talk about them. We don't believe that any of the opposition leaders should tie both or one of their hands behind their back in this process.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Once again, I'd just like to go over how all of this has gone down. Back in November, we learned about the fact that, according to sources within the security services, the CCP had interfered in Canadian elections several times, both in 2019 and in 2021. Global News noted that there was a candidate network which had been supported by Beijing, who even received money from the CCP. Throughout this reporting, we learned that one member was very close to the Chinese regime, close enough to interfere with a file involving 2 Canadians who were being detained on Chinese territory. Week after week, day after day, all throughout November, we heard things like this. So, the House of Commons voted in favor of a motion calling for an independent public inquiry, an inquiry that would be independent of the government. Which is one of the entities targeted by a lot of these media inquiries. Many people, including the special rapporteur, have noted that the information we heard was incomplete, that it lacked context. Despite this, one of the first decisions made by the government once the information came out was to expel a consular official in Toronto. He was kicked out of the country. Based on the information which now we're hearing is lacking in context and which was incomplete. So allow me to express a certain level of doubt. Now, I don't just have doubts about David Johnston. I have some doubts about the Prime Minister. You'll recall that the House called for a public inquiry based on a report that all parties had lent their support to. And what did Trudeau do? The Prime Minister decided on an approach which would let him control the narrative, control the information. He would appoint a special rapporteur. A special rapporteur, that's not something that comes up a lot in Canada. Maybe some of you remember hearing about one. I've never heard of a special rapporteur being appointed to investigate the government. So who launched this process? It was the Prime Minister himself, who is one of the people being targeted. By the Chinese regime. So this whole process got started. And then the government unilaterally, without consulting opposition parties, decided to choose who would be the special rapporteur. And then we heard all sorts of things. We heard that the special rapporteur was a long-standing friend of the Trudeau family. If you watched Mr. Johnston on TV this week, like I did, it was a bit surprising to see him unequivocally distance himself from the Prime Minister. No, it was just a few ski trips and lunches. Well, that's odd, because that same David Johnston, just a few years ago, was on TV boasting about his relationship with the Trudeau family, with Trudeau Sr., how his kids and Pierre Trudeau's kids were friends and ski buddies. Quite an abrupt change of tone. So once he boasted about how close he was to Trudeau and the Trudeau family. And then this week, he's distancing himself. Oh, no. He needs to show to appear neutral. So I'd like people to pay attention to that, and especially I would like Quebecers to be aware of this. The two different tones adopted by David Johnston. First, he wanted to boast about how close he was to the Trudeau family, and then later there's a big switch. There's a big difference, and that's concerning to me. We also learned that Mr. Johnston was a member of the Trudeau Foundation. And the Trudeau Foundation was itself targeted by the Chinese Communist Party. It was being used as a vehicle to influence the current Prime Minister. This has been quite clearly established. There was even a refund check that was sent back to a Chinese address. And then, surprise, surprise, we can look at the recommendations of the special rapporteur, and lo and behold, they're the exact same recommendations that the Prime Minister already supported. The recommendations say we don't need a public inquiry. We already have a National Security Intelligence Committee made up of parliamentarians, and they'll do the job themselves. So that makes you think, doesn't it? It makes you ask certain questions. We want to ask those questions to David Johnston next week. I have had the opportunity to, since the report was published, to speak to the media. I've been able to talk about why we would have more trust in a public inquiry than in the conclusions of Mr. Johnston's report. And it's very simple, really. If all the parties agree that a certain judge should be appointed, that we all agree to trust this person, well, then we would not be able to distrust that judge's recommendations. As I noted, Madam Chair, that there have already been independent inquiries on issues of national security. Reports have been published. There have been reports on some very delicate subjects. And there have been national inquiries with certain discussions behind closed doors. You can go look this up yourself. There has been national inquiries with some confidential information. It's been done. We have examined very, very, very delicate issues. And the reason this worked is because there was already a framework of trust in the public inquiry set up. So when those inquiries would publish recommendations, the parties would adhere to them. That is what we are calling for now. We want to shine a light on matters. We want to give trust back to the Canadian public. And this cannot happen when there's only one party that names itself judge and jury. It just can't happen. So since the very start, the Prime Minister has been saying, oh, we'll give it over to the NCCOP, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. They'll look at it, they'll do an examination, and they'll write some report. Here's the thing. That's not really a parliamentary committee. It's not a parliamentary committee. It's a committee of parliamentarians. It's actually part of the PMO. And the PMO is the one who will be able to decide what the committee publishes. That's the reality. And now that's what the Prime Minister proposes as an approach. I fully understand why the Conservative leader would not want to play into the Prime Minister's hands. All the Prime Minister cares about is silencing opposition leaders. Because now Mr. Johnston is saying, go and lead the report. But when you read it, you won't be able to talk about what's in it.
That's the reality. And that's it. That's why we have to stand up right now. We're not here to protect the government. If the NDP wants to do this by proposing an amendment that's not good, well, we understand that that's because it's part of this coalition agreement. But it's not for nothing that we're against this. We want to keep our right to be able to speak. And Canadians are entitled to know. And if we're not there, if we don't raise objections, if we don't stand up, well, unfortunately, everything is going to take place behind closed doors, and Canadians won't find out anything about the foreign interference by Beijing during the election. This amendment and sub-amendment, well, the sole purpose is to muzzle parliamentarians who voted in favor of a public inquiry in the majority. And that's why we have to hear from Mr. Johnson. That's why we have to find out why he made such a report. And then we have to ask him, what did he base himself on? And what about public hearings to continue studying this whole issue of foreign interference in the elections? We have significant questions that need to be asked. And before we ask, or before we try to force the recommendations made by the special reporter into play, we have to at least hear from him, and so he can explain why. And this amendment and sub-amendment have come too soon. We have to hear why Mr. Johnson made such a decision. But for the time being, it's important that we hear from Mr. Johnson, and we need to understand that the only way forward really is to have an independent public inquiry.
Merci, Mr. Bert.
Thank you, Mr. Berthold.
Question on the sub-amendment by Mr. Boulerice. Clerk.
Monsieur Boulerice.
Pour.
Ms. Romanato.
En faveur.
Ms. Sahota. Oh. Come back there. Mr. Turnbull.
In favor.
Mr. Fergus.
En faveur.
Ms. O'Connell.
In favor.
Oh. Ms. Sahota.
Yes, sorry. Yes.
Mr.
Yes.
Nader.
Against.
Mr. Barrett. Nay. Mr. Culkins.
Opposed.
Monsieur Berthold.
Contre.
Et Madame Gaudreau.
Non.
6 yeas, 5 nays.
So the sub-amendment carries. Seeing no hands. Oh, Mr. Barrett's hand. On the amendment as amended. Correct?
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Barrett.
I'd like to propose an amendment.
A sub-amendment.
Yes.
Can he sub-amend his after he... Give us a second. Because I don't want Mr. Nader calling me out and then challenging the chair. So just give me 30 seconds because I know it's going to come from where it's going to come from. So 30 seconds to confirm rules, and I'll be right back. Confirming you are sub-amending Mr. Fergus's amendment as amended, correct?
Yes, if you say so, Madam
Okay.
Chair. No challenge there. And the amendment, the sub-amendment, would be adding the words after opposition leaders, the following. No, it's just a little. After the Prime Minister has launched a national public inquiry.
Give us 30 seconds, and then you want to expand on that. Do you want to speak to it, right?
Yeah, briefly.
Okay, I'll come back to you. Just give us a couple seconds. I think we're all following this. So basically, what Mr. Boulerice suggested to Mr. Fergus's amendment, and then just adding in after a national public inquiry. Mr. Barrett, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. We've covered the ground already that the House has voted on the question of if there should be a public inquiry. The House didn't direct or ask the Prime Minister to subcontract out the question. We, as a majority, on behalf of Canadians, called for a public inquiry. And the work that's been done thus far, and though incomplete, does not satisfy the real concerns about confidence in our democratic institutions that Canadians have. And it's critical that whatever steps are taken going forward, they're done with the reflection of the will of Parliament, I should say, to have that public inquiry. Look, having the opposition leaders unable to speak to some of the elements is certainly a regrettable amendment to this motion. But ensuring that there's a process in place that has Canadians' confidence and one they're comfortable with. There's been public opinion polling that's been completed that shows that 3/4 of Canadians want a public inquiry. It's something that they understand. And my colleague, Mr. Berthold, quite rightly pointed out how we've, as a country, done this in the past. We've had public inquiries that deal with issues that relate directly to questions of national security. And they're, of course, always carried out in a way that protects methods and sources and our relationships with our intelligence sharing allies, like our Five Eyes partners. But you can believe that what's gone on in the last several years, the last couple of months, and what's revealed in Mr. Johnston's assessment is that the machinery of government with respect to the national security apparatus is failing Canadians. And a public inquiry is an understandable and a transparent way for Canadians to have some resolution to that. That's outside of the hands of the PMO. That's outside of the hands of the Trudeau Foundation affiliates, and that is truly independent. The outcomes that we get from a public inquiry, the report out from it, is not always one that the government is comfortable with, but Canadians have that confidence. They have that confidence in that process. And there's guardrails that have been used in the past that ensure that process is carried out with integrity and the selection of the selection of the individual who's charged with executing that inquiry. That's one of paramount importance, and why we've called for the government to consult with opposition parties on that. So I'll leave it there, Madam Chair. But it might be helpful for us to just get you, or perhaps the clerk, to read back the placing of my sub-amendment. I appreciate that I offered it verbally without having cobbled it onto the sub-amendment that was there. But if that's been circulated, great for everyone's understanding. I don't have any further. I don't have anything further to add on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. It has been received and it has been circulated, and the addition of the words is after opposition leaders, just for anyone who hasn't seen it. But check your inboxes. You should have it with you. So it is after. And Mr. Barrett has it confirmed. Perfect. Monsieur Berthold, suivi par Madame Goudreau. Vous n'avez rien à dire, monsieur?
You don't have anything to say, Mr. Beto? Ms. Goudreau. Yes. We've got here, Madam Chair. We've got to the end point. We can ask what we want, but with everything that's been announced, and hey, it's quite logical to hear from Mr. Johnson and ask him questions about his report, that a public inquiry be launched, and obviously it's been voted on. Until we have an independent inquiry, well, where can we go? How much farther can we go? So things are tightening up. The walls are shrinking. That's enough. We have to have a vote, and we have to be coherent with everything that we have in our position. I'd like to hear my colleagues. What's the argument against our experts and our citizens and the House of Commons? I think we can go around the table and vote on this issue. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Goudreau.
Thank you, Ms. Goudreau.
Question on the sub-amendment by Mr. Barrett. Clerk?
Mr. Barrett.
Yay.
Monsieur Berthold.
Oui.
Mr. Nader.
Yes.
Mr. Calkins.
Yes.
Ms. Romanato.
No.
Ms. Sahota.
No.
Mr. Turnbull.
Do I say his name again?
Mr. Turnbull.
No.
Monsieur Fergus.
Contre.
Ms. O'Connell.
No.
Madame Gaudreau.
Oui.
Monsieur Boulouris.
No.
5 yeas, 6 nays.
The sub-amendment is defeated. Going back to the main motion as a sub-amended, I guess now. Well, Mr. Boulouris amended it. Oh, we're going to the amendment as sub-amended. Back to the amendment as sub-amended. Mrs. Roberts, I see your hand up.
Thank you. I didn't get a chance to vote. My name wasn't called.
The members who are signed in currently were the 4 who were called.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Back to Mr. Fergus's amendment as amended, sub-amended. Mrs. Roberts, is your hand still up or is it down? It is down. Seeing no hands, I'm going to call the question on Mr. Fergus's amendment as amended.
Mr. Fergus.
En faveur.
Ms. Sahota, or sorry, Ms. Romanato.
En faveur.
Ms. Sahota.
Yes.
Mr. Turnbull.
Yes.
Ms. O'Connell.
Yes.
Mr. Nader.
Against.
Mr. Barrett.
Nay.
Mr. Calkins.
Against.
Monsieur Berthold.
Nope.
Madame Gaudreau.
No.
Monsieur Boulris.
En faveur.
6 yeas, 5 nays.
Mr. Fergus's amendment as amended carries. Now on to the main motion as amended. Mr. Fergus and Mr. Berthold.
Madame la Présidente, je retire ma main.
Madam Chair, I put my hand down. Mr. Berthold. Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like table an amendment, please. It's very long. No, it's very short. It's paragraph B. That paragraph B be deleted.
So we have an amendment. What is amendment? We have an amendment that paragraph B be deleted. Would you like to expand on that, Mr. Boulris, or is that Mr. Berthold? Would you like to? Pardon?
Please.
Monsieur Berthold, je m'excuse. Est-ce que vous voulez?
I apologize. Do you wish to elaborate, Mr. Berthold? It would be simple, Madam Chair. I'm a bit fed up with seeing the NDP's game. Trying to get out of this in a very inelegant fashion. Mr. Johnson came to the Prime Minister's defense, and now it's the NDP that's defending the Liberals. We had a clear motion. We wanted to repeat, and this is a position that the NDP took on several occasions, and it has told the media this. They've asked for an independent public inquiry, and we should have a real, a clear timeline for this public inquiry, Madam Chair, given that, well, I don't know how many minutes now that the Liberals and the NDP have been trying to water down the amendment to the detriment of democracy and transparency. As we said, we want to have Mr. Johnson to testify for at least 3 hours so we can have some answers to our questions. What led Mr. Johnson say that we should only get this information in secrecy? Why shouldn't Canadians be told about what's going on? So the intent's clear. Let's hear from Mr. Johnson, first of all. And then in committee, we'll have other opportunities in the weeks that lie ahead. We can repeat in the House our support or lack of support, depending on what the NDP decides, to have an independent public inquiry into Beijing's foreign interference during the election. Thank you, Mr. Berthold. Mr. Boulris. Thank you, Madam Chair. I feel that I must respond to the comment made by my Conservative colleague. He wants to abolish paragraph B, which talks about the public inquiry. He wants to abolish the paragraph, and then at the House he says he wants to have an inquiry at the House. So it's a kind of a funny contradiction. I think the NDP, well, will have access to these documents just as the Prime Minister will. So the leader of the Bloc, the NDP, and the Conservative and the Liberals are on the same footing as the Prime Minister in terms of access to the documents. These documents are very sensitive, and they're going to be able to take action after, similar to that the special reporter and the Prime Minister had. This is a promise. We're headed in the right direction. And we feel in the NDP that we shouldn't block this opportunity, this golden opportunity, which, whereas paragraph B says in the first paragraph that the committee wants to tell the House that we want a public inquiry. It would be quite contradictory that the Conservatives want to abolish this paragraph, which deals with a public inquiry.
Merci, Monsieur Buller.
Thank you, Mr. Bulleris. Since we have no other hands raised, we'll put the question to a vote. We're dealing with Mr. Berthold's sub-amendment.
Monsieur Berthold.
Oui.
Mr. Barrett.
Yay.
Mr. Nader. Mr. Nader.
In favor.
Mr. Culkins.
In favor.
Ms. Romanato.
No.
Ms. Sahota.
No.
Mr. Turnbull.
No.
Mr. Fergus.
Contre.
Ms. O'Connell.
No.
Madame Gaudreau.
Oui.
Et Monsieur Bulleris.
Contre.
5 yeas, 6 nays.
Yes, and so we're now on the main motion as amended. Debate. Mr. Fergus.
Ce n'est pas un débat, Madame la
It's not a debate. We have been here for about 4 hours. I'm a bit tired. Could the clerk please read the main motion as it is amended? Or can he distribute it to all members? Thank you.
We're going to need 2 minutes to get that all together, so we're going to pause for a quick. We're going to suspend. Yes, you know what? We're going to suspend for 5 minutes to get that to everybody. All right? We'll see you in 5 minutes. Thanks. Fergus, you had asked just for a status of where we were at. Do you want the floor back, or are you good with that? He's good. All right. Seeing no other hands, I'm going to ask the clerk, Mr. Berthold, before I call. Okay,
Ouais,
Mr. Berthold.
juste pour être sûr, Madame la Présidente.
Madam Chair, after the vote, I'd like to have a few minutes and
Qui a demandé, donc il y a
Merci.
quelqu'un d'autre avant.
so there'll be someone else before you. Fine.
So I guess that shows there's still no hand. I know, Mrs. Romanato, you're letting Mr. Berthold know that you told me that you wanted yes. So I will honor the conversation, but I need to call the question. That's how I can get to after the question. Okay. Clerk, calling the question on the main motion, on Mr. Barrett's motion as amended a couple times over.
Mr. Barrett. Mr. Berthold.
No.
Mr. Calkins.
No.
Mr. Brassard.
Nay.
Ms. Romanato.
En faveur.
Ms. Sahota.
Sorry about that. Yes.
Mr. Turnbull.
I vote yes.
Mr. Fergus.
Je vote en faveur.
Ms. O'Connell.
Yes.
Madame Gaudreau.
Hold on, but I'm in the
No.
vote.
Et Monsieur Boulouris.
Et oui.
6 yeas, 5 nays.
The motion as amended carries. Mrs. Romanato, followed by Mr. Berthold.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I move that this meeting now adjourn.
Calling the question.
Madame Romanato.
Yes.
Ms. Sahota.
Yes.
Mr. Turnbull.
Yes.
Mr. Fergus.
Pour.
Ms. O'Connell.
Yes.
Mr. Barrett. Monsieur Berthold.
No.
Mr. Calkins.
No.
Mr. Brassard.
No.
Madame Gaudreau.
No.
Et Monsieur Boulouris.
Oui.
6 yeas, 5 nays.
Meeting adjourned. See you Tuesday. Thank you. Excellent.